It said that there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. And I feel like a third constant, at least in my lifetime, has been Iran pursuing a nuclear weapon. This has just been one of those issues that's been around forever. When I was in middle school, eons and eons ago, I remember seeing a video of Benjamin Netanyahu at the UN holding up a picture of a cartoon bomb, the black sphere with the lit fuse, and drawing a line on it and saying that Iran was 90% of the way to 90% of the way to a nuclear weapon. And again, this was back in 2012, more than 10 years ago. A few years after that, there was the JCPOA nuclear agreement, and in 2018, 7 years ago now, Trump pulled out of that agreement. During his presidency, Joe Biden made sporadic efforts to renegotiate the JCPOA, but was not successful. And during that time, Iran's centrifuges, of course, were full steam ahead. So the International Atomic Energy Agency estimated earlier this year that Iran now has 250 kilograms of 60% highly enriched uranium, which in principle is enough for 6 nuclear bombs. So it would seem that if Iran has so far held off on assembling a nuclear weapon, it's been for political reasons rather than technical ones. So this is a fascinating topic and a very concerning one. And our guest today, Dr. Gary Samore, has had a front row seat to this issue for many, many years. It would really take most of our time together here to really go through his CVs, so I'll just hit the high points. Dr. Samore has had a long and illustrious career in the field of nuclear proliferation and arms control. He's previously served on the Council on Foreign Relations, at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. After receiving his PhD from Harvard, he worked at the RAND Corporation and at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory before embarking on a public service career spanning 3 decades. That culminated in his role as White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction from 2009 until 2013 under President Obama. He then served as the head of United Against Nuclear Iran from 2013 to 2015. Since 2019, he's been a professor at Brandeis University, and he's now the head of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies there. So, Professor, you are most welcome. We're very, very glad to have you here. And with that, I will turn things over to Armand.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you for the introduction. And Professor Samore, thank you for being on our program podcast. Very kind of you. Trevor mentioned the details, and I think he outlined everything perfectly. I want to start with the technical aspect of it, and then Trevor and I back and forth with your help would go through the political, technical, and international implication of it. Well, there is a discussion about that Iran's enrichment of the uranium is at a high point. And, people mostly say that when you reach the level of 60% of the enriching uranium, you already got about 90% of the job done. So I want to first of all ask you, as a fact-checking process, what's the current state of the Iran's nuclear program in terms of technical? And the other thing that I want to ask is, so many people discuss one of the reasons that Iran didn't trigger weaponizing its nuclear program is political decision, which I believe to some extent might be. The other thing that we hearing from it on and off is a matter of delivery, which I think we don't really touch it or talk about in a public media or media outlets. And there been a discussion that even Iran makes the bomb, Iranians would have a hard time to deliver it because the Iranian ballistic missiles capability is not at the point right now to be able to carry out a nuclear warhead yet. So I wanted to ask you also that, while we are on the technical front, is this true? Does Iran have a delivery problem? And aside that, can I, give us a last update as an expert on the Iran's nuclear project?
Sure. Thanks to both of you for inviting me to be on your podcast. Very happy to do this. So Iran is what is called a nuclear threshold state, meaning that the barriers to produce nuclear weapons are political, not technical. Now, there are 2 parts of Iran's nuclear threshold capacity. One is the production of raw material, in this case, 90% enriched uranium, which is the level of enrichment Iran was working on in their earlier weaponization program. And there's no doubt, as Trevor said, that Iran can produce a couple of bombs worth of 90% enriched uranium within a relatively short time, probably just a few weeks. That would be detected by the IAEA pretty quickly, the international agency that inspects Iran's nuclear facilities, but it's certainly possible Iran could produce one or two bombs worth before the IAEA inspectors would learn of it. And of course, once they found out, they would report that publicly. The second part of Iran's nuclear status is weaponization. Once they have the raw material, how long would it take for Iran to actually produce a nuclear test device or a deliverable nuclear weapon? I think that's much more difficult to estimate because, of course, those activities, to the extent that they're taking place, are secret. They're not open, they're not subject to international inspection. Certainly the US and Israel and other countries try to follow what Iranian scientists are doing, but it's not clear the extent to which they're able to have a comprehensive view. Most public estimates from government officials is that it would probably take Iran a couple of months, once they have the raw material, once they have the 90% enriched uranium, it would probably take a couple of months to produce a testable device or a bomb that could be delivered by aircraft. Producing a missile warhead, and this is what you were asking about, Armand, would take more time because of the complicated physics of producing a nuclear warhead that has to withstand the acceleration and heat of a missile delivery. Iran has missiles that are large enough to deliver the kind of nuclear warhead Iran was working on 20 years ago. In fact, there are some diagrams from that period showing how the warhead would fit, or how the nuclear device would fit on top of the Shahab-3, which is the mainstay of Iran's liquid-fueled missile force. So technically, I think they could deliver a nuclear warhead, but there are questions about the ability of Iran's missile force to penetrate Israel's missile defenses. As we saw last October, a number of the missiles failed on launch, or they were intercepted by the Patriot and Arrow missile defense systems. Of course, with a nuclear weapon, even if it's inaccurate, even if only a few get through, they have a devastating effect. But to be confident of having a reliable retaliatory capability, Iran would probably need a number of nuclear weapons, because they couldn't be certain that the weapons they have wouldn't be destroyed in a preemptive attack or wouldn't be vulnerable to missile defense. So I think what we can say is Iran is a threshold nuclear state in the sense that they could produce nuclear weapons once they made a political decision to do so, but they're still some ways away from having a reliable and effective nuclear arsenal, the way that Israel or Pakistan or North Korea or the United States has.
Before going forward, I really appreciate your response, and I'm sure that Trevor has stuff to share and questions to ask. But you mentioned about the delivery, and you mentioned about the timings that Iran has in terms of both enrichment and also having an accurate or reliable delivery system. So correct me if I'm wrong, so you are saying that if even Iran makes the decisions, let's say that today Ayatollah Khamenei in Tehran makes a decision that we want the bomb, from that moment to the moment they actually have the capability, possess the capability to project a threat against the Israelis or other allies of the United States, it would take more than a year. You say that delivery and also the raw material altogether is going to be in matter of weeks again.
Well, they can produce the raw material, which is 90% enriched uranium, in a couple of weeks. But weaponizing that material into an air-delivered bomb, in other words, a bomb that could be delivered by long-range aircraft, most people estimate a couple of months. I can't be more precise than that because the information is all classified. And since Iran has never done it, even the Iranians won't know exactly how long it would take before they can produce a nuclear weapon or a bomb. So if you wanted to be conservative on the cautious side, then you'd say that once the supreme leader made a political decision, within a couple of months, Iran could have a rudimentary nuclear deterrent, a couple of air-delivered nuclear bombs, which is a pretty sufficient deterrent against existential threats, because only a few nuclear weapons would, of course, destroy most countries in the Middle East.
Right.
I think it is interesting that I think you raised the point earlier that Israel's missile defense system is pretty good, but it isn't perfect. And one of the things that's notable about the Iron Dome in particular is it sort of detects where a missile is projected to land and says, well, if it's just out in the desert somewhere, we got to be economical. Let's not shoot that one down. Like, that doesn't seem like it's terribly useful against a nuclear weapon. And in any event, I actually had a different question, which is that we're operating on what you've talked about so far has been all about sort of the breakout time, where if the Ayatollah makes the decision, we're going to go for a nuclear weapon now, then they would throw caution to the wind and they would plow forward with it, and they could get it done in a couple of weeks, but there's no way that they could possibly do it without tipping off the IAEA. And I guess my question is, if they wanted to do it on the sly, what would their options be? Like, how intrusive really is the IAEA inspection regime? Because I know there have been problems in the past, like the IAEA has complained about them failing to declare sites and turning off cameras and this kind of thing. And so there's always sort of been this assumption that certainly prior to 2018, it's not like 20 kilos of HEU could just go missing. There are safeguards in place, so they could say, hey, wait a minute. So is that still the case? I mean, are you still confident that the IAEA would be able to detect any effort to like enrich 60% HEU to 90%?
Yes, but there would be a time delay. I mean, the Iranians have curtailed IAEA access to the two main enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow. And so they could conceal their production of 90% enriched uranium for a couple of days, maybe even a couple of weeks. I mean, the IAEA inspectors are only granted access when Iran is willing to let them go to the facilities. So if Iran was trying to break out and wanted to conceal it for as long as possible, they simply wouldn't let the inspectors go into the facilities. Now, over time, that would become very suspicious, and people would assume that Iran was beginning to produce 90% enriched uranium. But there could be, a short period of time in days or weeks where Iran would be able to produce 90% without international detection. The much more sensible way for Iran to produce weapons-grade uranium is to build a completely separate secret enrichment plant, which of course Iran has tried to do in the past. I mean, the Fordow facility was begun as a secret facility, not declared to the IAEA, and the intent was to have a couple of hundred centrifuges at this very heavily fortified secret facility where Iran could produce weapons-grade uranium at its leisure. So far, Iran has not been very effective in concealing efforts to build secret facilities. And one of the big features of Iran's nuclear program, in contrast to, say, a country like North Korea, is that foreign intelligence agencies have been extremely successful in uncovering undeclared or secret nuclear activities, both production of fissile material and weaponization. Now, of course, that could change. I mean, the Iranian counterintelligence agencies might be able to figure out ways to protect their secrets more effectively. But up to now, as far as I can tell, the US and Israel and the UK and the other Western powers, they seem to feel pretty confident that if the Ayatollah made a decision to produce nuclear weapons, we would learn about it within a reasonable period of time. Maybe not immediately, but within a couple of weeks in any event.
So I think that's a good place to put a capstone on that. I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk about the domestic political considerations within Iran. Um, so obviously, you're not an Iran political expert per se, but do you get a sense that this is a political issue in Tehran where there's some people on one side of it and some people on the other? Like, for instance, of course, last year, the reformist Mr. Pezeshkian was elected as Iran's president. Um, there's no sign of daylight between him and Supreme Leader Khamenei on the nuclear issue, as far as you can tell. Is there?
Well, actually, there does appear to be a bit of a difference on how to respond to President Trump's offers to negotiate. President Pezeshkian has appeared to be more open to negotiate with the U.S. in order to remove sanctions and improve the Iranian economy. And the Supreme Leader has been very vocal about his opposition to negotiations with President Trump because, according to the Supreme Leader, Trump can't be trusted because President Trump withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So I think there is a debate in Iran about whether and how to negotiate with the United States. On the question of whether or not to produce nuclear weapons, I think the issue has long been debated within Iran. And of course, it's very murky. After the setbacks Iran suffered since October 7, the fall of President Bashar Assad in Syria, the defeat of Hezbollah, the devastation of Gaza and Hamas, the voices in favor of producing nuclear weapons have been louder. There are still some who argue against production of nuclear weapons, and I think the strongest argument against is that it would be too risky. That if Iran tries to build nuclear weapons, it will be exposed pretty quickly and is highly likely to provoke a military attack from the US and Israel, which of course would be devastating to Iran. So my view is that if Iran felt they could get away with producing nuclear weapons, they would do so. They would have done so years ago. But what holds them back is deterrence. What holds them back is the fear of exposure leading to war.
I just have one last question before I turn it back over to Armand here. It's interesting that of the nuclear states, with I guess the one exception of North Korea, they were and Israel, depending on sort of how you look at it. These were all signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty who had already had nuclear weapons at the time that the NPT was signed, or they're states that never signed it to begin with and then went on to develop nuclear weapons. And North Korea, of course, was in the NPT, and then they withdrew and then went back in and then withdrew again. So Iran is still a member of the NPT in good standing. And moreover, Supreme Leader Khamenei in the past has issued sort of these fatwas, these religious messages condemning nuclear weapons and saying that Iran wouldn't want to build one. Do you get the sense that this matters at all? I mean, is this just a fig leaf, or would Iran, if they were going to develop nuclear weapons, make any kind of effort to withdraw from the NPT before doing it, or does it just not matter at all?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, Iran has certainly used the threat of withdrawing from the NPT as a political instrument. So the Iranians will often say, if we are attacked, we will withdraw from the NPT. And then, of course, Iran would be legally free to pursue nuclear weapons because the NPT has a withdrawal clause with 60 days notice, and there would be no IAEA inspection of their nuclear facilities. So Iran has used the threat of withdrawing from the NPT as diplomatic leverage. I think that if Iran at some point in the future decides to build nuclear weapons, they're much more likely to try to do it in secret, in undeclared activities. And certainly if you look at the other non-parties to the NPT who pursued nuclear weapons, India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea, they all pursued covert programs before they were ready to conduct a nuclear test. So that is generally the pattern. that countries follow. It's much safer to do it in secret until you have all the pieces ready to go, and then you can confront the world with a fait accompli. Now, you're right, Iran is different than the other four because it's a party to the NPT. But, in my view, Iran has been cheating on its NPT commitments for many, many years. And it's not the only country in the Middle East. I mean, Iraq, Libya, Syria, they all cheated on their NPT commitments with secret programs as well until those programs were stopped.
Yeah, you mentioned about Iran's cheating and Iran's probability of Iran's making a concealed move toward making a bomb if they want to. So I have a couple of questions on this front. Let's say that Iranian made the decision and Iranian had a parallel system to doing so, another facility or even within the Natanz. Uh, the first question that I have, once they made the decision before building the actual nuclear bomb within that couple of weeks, is there anything that Israel can do or United States to militarily speaking stopping there? And the reason that I'm asking, because there is always a back and forth conversation out there that Iranians, as you mentioned, nuclear facilities are very well fortified. They are under the ground, under the mountains. And mostly there is also an argument that I think President Obama was one of the people who made it, draw it, or at least that Iranians have the know-how. So they know how to build it. They have nationalized the science. So once they make the decision, they actually can fulfill it. It's a matter of timing. So is there anything that we, the West or the Israel can do to physically restrict Iran and prevent Iran doing so? Is there any military solution to it, permanent military solution?
I don't think there's a permanent military solution unless you invaded and occupied Iran and replaced the government.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, that's not a practical military option. So the question you're asking is whether the US and Israel are able to destroy the key facilities that Iran would use in order to produce weapons-grade uranium and weaponize the program. And I think the answer is yes. I think the US has enough military capacity so it could heavily damage or destroy the two enrichment plants and facilities that are used for the production of raw material for the enrichment plants, that's at Esfahan, and facilities that are suspected of being involved in weaponization work. Israel by itself doesn't have the same capability, at least that's the conventional view. Only the US has the necessary ordnance and sufficient air power, of course, located right in the Persian Gulf in bases that are there, plus whatever aircraft the US brings to the attack. Israel is so far away, it could do damage, as we've seen, but it would be very difficult for the Israelis to actually destroy those enrichment facilities. Now, of course, you're right, Iran can rebuild. I mean, simply destroying the facilities doesn't destroy the knowledge that the Iranian scientists have. And then the question would be, how much time does it really buy? And I don't think you can really, a couple of years maybe, but I think it's very difficult to give a very precise or accurate assessment of how much time it would buy. The other issue is that I think a clean attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is very unlikely. I think Iran is bound to retaliate, first of all, against Israel. But if the US is involved, I think Iran is bound to retaliate against US facilities in the Persian Gulf. And of course, the US will respond to that retaliation by attacking the Iranian Air Force and Navy and other military facilities. So to me, an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is very likely to lead to a broader war. As I said, not an invasion of Iran, because nobody has the troops, that are capable of doing that, but a very significant conflict that would cause damage, extensive damage, not only to Iran's military infrastructure, but you could imagine a situation where Iran's economic infrastructure, oil and gas, is destroyed. The US could impose a naval blockade and prevent oil from prevent Iran from shipping oil. The Iranians might retaliate against the Arab oil producers, so you could have a big disruption in international oil flows. In other words, or to put it simply, an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities is fraught with risk. And I don't think Trump would take that action unless he really felt compelled, unless he really felt that Iran had made a decision to produce nuclear weapons, and the only way to stop them was to resort to military force.
Thank you. You mentioned about the military risk and also following to the economical and financial risk of Iran making the decision to build a bomb for both Iran and the rest of the region. Uh, uh, I had something in mind to ask, and that let's say Iranian been successful in building the bomb, and they concealed it, they built it, or for some reason the Israelis and United States trying. I know it sounds impossible, but try to turn their eyes otherwise. How would the Iranian would send a signal that we have the bomb? Would it be a classical show of force? Would it be a nuclear test, or there would be any other ways that they can send a signal in a console way that we don't have the bomb, we have the bomb, but not demonstrating it? And the reason that I'm asking is because inside the Iran there is one of the argument against the nuclear bomb, aside the threat and the security risk following to it, is that the argument is that if Iran makes the bomb, Iran would be the loser user. And what they mean by it is that if we build the bomb, let's say that Iran today makes the bomb successfully, so the first thing that would happen would trigger a nuclear race across the region. Saudis want their bomb. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, has said it plainly a couple of times that if the Iranian get it, we will want it. Turks maybe want to pursue one nuclear bombs. Other the Arab nations like Egypt want to do so. Probably Pakistan will double down on its nuclear products or nuclear capabilities. So Iran will find itself as a sanctioned, isolated, financially struggled nation that already possesses a limited capability to have expand its nuclear arsenal in a region that the rest of the countries don't necessarily suffer, specifically speaking the Arab nations, from such financial restriction. And they may want to produce a nuclear arsenal or purchase it if it is possible. So in that case, I think my question actually now has a two main flank. Is that first, how Iranian can signal it without triggering a nuclear race in the Middle East, in the region that we have the bomb, and second, if they fail in doing so, what would be the implication of Iran's having or possessing nuclear arsenal for the regional power order in the Middle East?
So I think a nuclear test is by far the most convincing demonstration that Iran has nuclear capability. And we know that in the nuclear weapons program that Iran was conducting before 2002, there were plans to dig a deep shaft and to conduct an underground nuclear test. So I continue to think that if Iran produces a small nuclear arsenal, they'll use one of those devices for a test in order to demonstrate their capability and to strengthen deterrence. Now, in terms of the effect on the region, I have heard some Iranians argue that it would ultimately hurt Iran if they build nuclear weapons because it would lead to an arms race in the region. There's a counter argument to that. The counter argument is, first of all, the Iranians say, the region is already nuclearized. You've got India, you've got Pakistan, you've got Israel, you have the United States, all nuclear powers. So from that standpoint, Iran would simply be adding to an nuclear arms race that already exists in the region. People also argue, Iranians argue, that it will take the Arabs many years before they're capable of producing nuclear weapons because, as I mentioned earlier, the previous Arab countries that tried to produce nuclear weapons, even Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, they all failed. And their nuclear programs, including that of Saudi Arabia, are very rudimentary. So we're talking about many years before they could catch up to Iran. And finally, Iranian advocates for nuclear weapons say we face an existential threat. The United States, abated by Israel, is trying to destroy the Islamic Republic. And our defenses have been stripped bare because of the events since October 7. So we have an overwhelming, urgent need to deter an attack from the United States and Israel. And nuclear weapons is the only way to deter the United States and Israel from attacking us.
There is not much to lose for those who, in view of those who are at least advocating for it.
That's correct. That's correct.
It is interesting. I think this is, I want to go a little bit more into how a nuclear Iran would engage with, for instance, Israel differently than it does now. And I think there's sort of an interesting parallel here, which is the relationship between India and Pakistan. And what I mean by that is, well, since Pakistan nuclearized, with the exception of the Kargil business in 1999, there hasn't been a war between India and Pakistan. But it's since then, Pakistan has continued sort of aggressive behavior towards India, has continued to sort of foment terrorism in India, as you remember, because you were at the Bombay hotel when it came under attack. And there's always the sort of the implication that, well, India has nuclear weapons, so India can retaliate against Pakistan. But now Pakistan has nuclear weapons too, so that's sort of off the table. And so where this comes in my view, with Israel is Iran. It can have a handful of nuclear weapons, but if Israel continues to bomb it and continues to assassinate people in Iran and continues to sort of screw with its foreign policy in Syria and Iraq and so on, the nuclear deterrent doesn't seem to be all that useful to Iran, because the only thing that you can do with it is to start a nuclear war, and Israel can retaliate. And so it's sort of a no-win situation.
Well, I agree with you. I think that if Iran and Israel had nuclear weapons, they would both be more cautious about engaging in activities that could escalate to a nuclear conflict, just like India and Pakistan do. The concern in Israel is that if Iran had nuclear weapons, it would be more confident that it could engage in an aggressive policy in the region, because Israel would be more constrained about taking action against Iran. So, the scenario you often hear in Israel is that Iran's support for Hezbollah would be much greater, because the Iranians would be less concerned about Israel retaliating directly against Iran, because that might escalate to a nuclear conflict. So I don't, between those two theories, one that both sides would be more cautious, and the other that being armed with nuclear weapons would make Iran more aggressive, I don't think we can confidently predict which is accurate. All I can say is that the Israelis are not prepared to take that chance, nor is the United States. I mean, it's been US policy going back to the Reagan administration that we would not accept the Islamic Republic having nuclear weapons. Even when the Shah was in power, the US would not agree to provide him with sensitive nuclear technologies as part of Iran's nuclear power program. So, yes, there's an academic theoretical argument about what the impact would be on the region if Iran had nuclear weapons, but it's not an argument that guides the policy of the United States and Israel, or the Western countries for that matter.
There's one other thing I was thinking about is Israel, of course, has conducted these kinds of sort of attacks before on other Arab states that are pursuing nuclear weapons. Of course, Syria in 2007, Iraq in the 1980s, and it seems like this never sort of led to any kind of full-fledged war before. It's not like Syria tried to invade the Golan Heights after Assad's secret nuclear reactor was bombed. So obviously, any Israeli and American full-scale strike on Iran is going to be a lot bigger than those two examples. It's going to involve a lot more destruction, and the pressure is going to be much more substantial on Iran to retaliate. But is it the sort of thing that you think is going to lead to a full-scale war? I mean, is there any way that we can sort of know this before it happens?
I don't think you can know. I mean, there's an argument that Iran would retaliate, but they would try to calibrate the retaliation so that it didn't trigger a broader war. And certainly the attacks we saw last year in April and October appeared to be calibrated. I mean, the Iranians were not, as far as we can tell, they weren't deliberately trying to kill civilians. They were trying to attack military targets, not very successfully. So yes, one scenario is that Iran would retaliate, but in a way that would be designed not to lead to a broader conflict. But I think when you're dealing with the use of military force, all kinds of unintended consequences and actions can take place. I mean, if Iran shoots missiles at Israel, there's no guarantee that an errant missile won't land on a school and kill a lot of young school children. And then the Israelis would be obviously under much more pressure to respond. So, you know, the consequences of an Israeli or American attack on Iran's nuclear facilities are almost impossible to predict with any confidence.
Trevor, I mentioned about the Arab states program, nuclear program, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Egyptians. You also mentioned that, and kind of so far, I think we concluded that Israel, and with the help of with or without the help of the other countries, successfully stopped or halted that programs. I have two questions, but the first questions that I want to ask is that what makes Iranian program different from the Arab programs, the Syrians, the Iraqis, and Egyptians, that so far Israel didn't make any move to halt it physically, or even is there any differences in a nuclear project in Iran and in Syria and in Iraq in terms of mechanism, in terms of the technology? What's the main difference?
Well, I think there are several differences. One is that obviously Syria and Iraq are much more vulnerable to being attacked by Israel because they're much closer. And the nature of the programs, because they were based on reactors, is that those reactors are much more exposed to military attack than enrichment, which can be placed underground or inside mountains and therefore more difficult to destroy. Another big difference is that in both the case of Syria and Iraq, they were very heavily dependent on external assistance. So in the case of Syria, it was the North Koreans. In the case of Iraq, it was the French. The Iranians got the basic technology for enrichment from Pakistan, but they've really developed that themselves. I mean, Iranian engineers and scientists are now capable of producing their own versions of and better, more efficient, more powerful versions of the centrifuges they originally got from Pakistan. Iran still probably needs to buy some of the key raw material on the open market or the black market, but they have an indigenous capability that's much stronger than what the Syrians and the Iraqis or the Libyans had, because Iran, compared to those Arab countries, has a much stronger cadre of engineers and scientists. And, therefore, they're more independent in terms of their nuclear capacity.
Thank you. And, you mentioned that this was a policy for United States to not allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon since even the time of Shah. So, and I think during the Reagan after the Islamic Revolution was quite materialized too, up until today. But the question that I think many people have is that if this is the policy and if the military action or military response to it would be measured for it would be quite costly. So what are the odds that diplomacy can prevent it? I mean, it's been decades and decades since the United States, that generation of the statesmen in the United States tried to, through the diplomatic and political and sanction means, stop the Iranians from advancing their program. They were on and off successful. As I understand the JCPOA is debatable, but there was a setback in Iran's program in terms of enrichment, both size and level. So, but once the United States withdraw from it, we have witnessing Iranian actually restarting the program quite quickly. So does it mean that the United States should throw off the diplomacy option completely off the table? Can we say that at this point the diplomatic measure wouldn't work, or we can say that it would work, but the way that we applied it wasn't the most sound ways in the most of the cases?
Well, for every US president, at least the last four presidents, the diplomatic option is much more attractive than the military option, because as we talked about, the military option is really fraught with risks.
Yes.
Whereas diplomacy, even if it doesn't solve the problem, it can delay the problem by imposing constraints and limits on Iran's nuclear program. And the JCPOA was very much a mechanism for delaying Iran's capacities for 10 or 15 years. So President Trump has now said that he prefers diplomacy. He sent a letter to the Supreme Leader proposing that nuclear talks resume. So far, the Iranian response has been ambiguous. Supreme Leader has said that he doesn't trust the US and doesn't want to approve talks, but the foreign ministry and the Iranian president have indicated they might be willing to resume talks with the US. I don't know what will happen. There are still lots of details that have to be worked out. Will the talks be secret? Will they be public? Will they be direct talks, or will they be indirect as they were under the Biden administration? Will they be bilateral? Will they be multilateral? I mean, all of these issues have to be resolved. My guess is that at the end of the day, there probably will be some kind of US-Iran diplomatic engagement on the nuclear issue. But I don't frankly expect those talks to produce much of anything. I think the Iranians are very happy that they've achieved such advances in their nuclear program, and they have no intention of going back to the more limited capability they had at the time of the JCPOA 10 years ago. Now, Iran might make some cosmetic limits. They might reduce their stockpile of 60% enriched uranium. They might freeze enrichment above 5% or 20%. They might allow some additional monitoring. And Trump might be prepared to accept that as a way to avoid war and for Trump to declare that he's solved this problem. But I think there's a mistaken view in Washington that Iran is very vulnerable and weak now, and the US can demand very extensive concessions, like complete elimination of the enrichment program. I don't think Iran is prepared to do that unless it's under dire threat. And that depends on A, whether Trump can enlist the Russians and the Chinese to pressure Iran, and B, whether Trump is really serious about using military force. If both of those are true, then Iran will make more concessions. If neither of those are true, then I think the deal is likely to produce, if there is a deal, it's likely to produce a pretty limited result.
So just a quick question before handing it to Trevor, and I'm sorry. So you are saying that if there will be a deal, then most likely neither the Iranians and nor the Americans would be even willing to make the sacrifices that they did during the JCPOA. So it's going to be something less restrictive or more cosmetic than the JCPOA.
Yes, I think it's likely to be less rigorous than the JCPOA in terms of the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, unless, as I said, if Trump can, do a deal on Ukraine, and in return, Putin is prepared to put pressure on Iran, or Trump does a deal with the Chinese. The Chinese are in a very strong leverage position against Iran because most of Iran's oil exports go to China. So China could, in theory, really damage Iran economically. So if Trump can do a deal with Beijing and Moscow to pressure Iran, and if Trump is really serious about using military force in the absence of an acceptable deal, then I could imagine the Iranians making bigger concessions. But I don't think either of those are likely to be true. So I think the outcome is most likely to be pretty modest.
Oh, thank you.
I guess it's sort of always understood that there's sort of a spectrum here of concessions. And so, the US and Iran, they can make a little deal that involves Iran giving up a little bit of sort of their enrichment capability in exchange for, a few sanctions relief measures around the edges. I'm sort of mentally comparing that to the JCPOA 10 years ago, which was, as I recall, and I'm sure you remember this much better than I do, was very comprehensive, sort of addressed all of these different parts of Iran's nuclear enrichment, and did not permanently end any of them. Was all sort of questions of, you can't do this for 10 years, you can't do this for 15 years, and so on. But was basically sort of this grand bargain of nuclear limits in exchange for pretty extensive sanctions relief. So do you think the ship has sailed on another agreement like that? I mean, just sort of the political conditions in the United States and Iran, and, the relations with Russia and China being what they are, like, we're not going to get back to that. And if Iran is prevented from getting a nuclear weapon, it's probably going to be because of military action.
Well, even a limited agreement. I mean, first of all, yes, I think the conditions that made the JCPOA possible don't exist today, both in terms of, as you say, the relationship between the US and Russia, China, also in terms of domestic politics in Iran, where the so-called reformers are in a much weaker position than the so-called hardliners, whatever that means. So for all those reasons, I don't think the conditions that produce the JCPOA are there. I'm also not confident the Trump administration is competent to carry out a very complicated, several years long negotiation. I mean, that requires a really top-notch team. And at least so far, we haven't seen that. I mean, Trump has kind of indicated that Steve Witkoff will be the interlocutor for Iran, but Witkoff, who seems very capable, he's doing everything. He's doing the Ukraine negotiations, he's doing the Gaza negotiations. So I'm not convinced that he's going to have the bandwidth to also do Iran negotiations, which are very intense and protracted and difficult. So I don't think that's likely, but even a limited agreement, if it kept Iran at the point where they were not within a few weeks of breakout, even that period could last for some time if the Iranians continue to think that's better, having that threshold is better than the risks of going for a bomb.
I was laughing the whole time that you were talking there, because you got ahead of me. This was my next question, which is, of course, you have extensive experience in these sorts of negotiations. You did this under Clinton, you did this under Obama, and so looking at Trump's Iran team, I'm wondering what you sort of make of it. Like, is this are the pieces in place where you could look at this and say, well, these are serious negotiators? I get the sense that Trump prioritizes this. There could be some sort of the groundwork being laid for an agreement, after months and months of diplomacy. Do you get that sense when you look at Trump's team, or is it sort of more like a lower priority?
Well, I think it is a priority for Trump. I think in the Middle East, he has a couple of priorities. One is to expand the Abraham Accords to include Saudi Arabia, but it looks to me like that's not possible as long as the current Israeli government continues to oppose any kind of progress toward a separate Palestinian state. And the other priority for Trump is to a nuclear deal with Iran, which would avoid a war. So far, I don't see any evidence that there's any Iran team. I mean, beyond Trump kind of indicating that Witkoff will be the key person, and of course, Witkoff is the one who delivered the letter to the UAE, Trump's letter to the UAE that eventually found its way into the hands of the supreme leader. I mean, it could be that I'm just not plugged into what's happening. I mean, if the Iranians agree to start negotiations with the U.S., the Trump administration will have to put a team together, right? I mean, you need technical experts, you need a variety of representatives from different agencies. So somebody will be responsible for the Iran file, but right now I don't know anybody. I don't see anybody who's been appointed to do that. Do you? Have you heard any names?
Well, I mean, of course, there's Mr. Witkoff, but like you said, he's got the Iran file, but he's also got the Gaza file, and now increasingly the Ukraine file. And so I'm just thinking, like, if I were a diplomat, this would be my worst nightmare. Having to solve every problem on behalf of Trump, and it seems like too many hats to wear.
Do you think is there any specific reason that he relies so much on Witkoff, and is it in general quite because Mr. Witkoff, from what I know, he's not a 10-year diplomat. He's a political appointee. Is it quite standard to have someone out of the State Department to be the handler of the Iran's nuclear case? Because and correct me if I'm wrong, during the President Obama administration, the deal was mostly mastered by people who were kind of crafted by the State Department. They were 10-year diplomats, or at least 10-year people in the international affairs.
Well, I mean, normally the negotiations are handled out of the State Department, but every administration is different. I mean, Trump can decide how he wants to manage these negotiations. I think he trusts Witkoff. As far as I can tell, Witkoff is a competent negotiator. But if there's going to be a serious U.S.-Iran negotiation, I think there has to be an office, either at the State Department or at the White House, that's responsible for conducting those negotiations. And so far, at least as far as I can tell, such a unit hasn't been set up. And, under Obama, it was Secretary of State Kerry who took a very lead role. So far, Rubio hasn't, as far as I can tell, hasn't been involved at all. So I think it's still a little early. And maybe, the Trump team doesn't have to do anything because Iran hasn't said yes yet. But even getting to yes is going to require, as I say, there are lots of modalities that have to be determined, whether the talks are secret or public or direct or indirect or multilateral or bilateral. So, if Witkoff starts going to Oman, I think that'll be a good sign that something is going on, something is happening, behind the scenes. Because I think the Iranians, on balance, they prefer secret talks with the U.S. I think they find it difficult to speak directly to the great Satan, and especially Trump, because, of course, he's responsible for killing Soleimani. So I think in a way it would be a bit humiliating for the Iranians to talk openly to the Trump administration. So my guess is that they'll probably want to keep it as secret as they can, as they did under Obama. I mean, most of the negotiations for the JCPOA took place in secret in Oman before they were then brought to the public P5+1 meetings in Vienna.
One quick question then. Why is that you mentioned Oman? If they start talking through the channels in Oman, that would be a good sign. Why is that this time Mr. Witkoff or United States chose UAE as a mediator? Because I think it was a Washington D.C. based Iran expert, an actual true Iran expert, who mentioned that the fact that the UAE is sending the message or delivering the message is not necessarily a good sign. Do we have a such thing as a good messenger and a bad messenger, a messenger with the good news and bad news, and UAE is a bad cop? I mean, why was it the President Trump, you think, shifted from the Oman, which is a traditional and, let's say, quite effective meditator, to the UAE this time? Is it Mr. Witkoff's preference, or there is something broader behind it?
I can't answer that question. I mean, Iran obviously prefers Oman to the UAE. Why the Trump administration chose to send the letter through the UAE, I don't know. It may just be that they're very comfortable working with the UAE. There are extremely close ties between the Trump White House and the UAE leadership, as there is with Saudi. So that may be the reason. It may not be anything more complicated than that. I don't know that there's really much connection between the White House and Oman.
So I sort of have, I guess I'll ask the final question here, which is nobody's really quite sure what Iran's nuclear status is going to look like in another 5 or 10 years. But there's sort of a few pathways that we can identify. One is nothing happens. Iran sort of stays at the threshold that it's at right now, with the understanding that if they really wanted to, they could get a nuclear weapon within a couple of weeks. A second is Iran takes the plunge. They do develop nuclear weapons, letting the chips fall where they may from that, but probably not endangering the regime at all. A third option is they negotiate some kind of a deal with the Trump administration, which probably is not going to be to the same degree as the JCPOA was, but might limit their enrichment somewhat, might put them a few weeks further back from in terms of breakout time. And then the last scenario, of course, is Israel and the United States bomb Iran, and significantly degrade the program, and the consequences from that. Again, we'll just have to see. So, which one of these pathways do you think is the most likely? I mean, if you're Trump, how do you look at this and think about sort of how things are going to proceed absent sort of U.S. intervention, or rather not even Trump, but if you're some observer like me or like you, sort of how to evaluate which of these things is most likely to happen?
Well, I think you've done a good job of laying out 4 reasonable scenarios, any of which are plausible to me. I'm going to not answer your question because I think it depends on some really significant unknowns. And the biggest unknown is the life expectancy of the supreme leader and who takes over after him. And as far as I can tell, and I'm not an Iran expert, but just from listening to people talk, there's huge uncertainty about who would take over, what the Islamic Republic would look like after the succession. And I think it's difficult to anticipate what the next government's policies toward nuclear will be. I mean, I think we have a pretty good sense of Khamenei, right? He wants to have a nuclear weapons capability, but he's afraid to take the plunge because of the risk of that leading to a war. And I can imagine that continuing. I can imagine him trying once again to build a secret facility and hoping to get away with it. I think him sort of an open breakout is the least likely scenario because it's just too risky for Iran. I mean, it's terribly risky. And I don't see the US and Israel deciding to ignore Iran having nuclear weapons. I mean, that's been such a important part of US policy, Democrat and Republican. And I think, as far as I can tell, in Israel, it's a pretty strong consensus too. It's not just Netanyahu. So I could imagine if the Supreme Leader continues, you could have the current situation or, with a modest nuclear deal. I think that's more likely than Iran deciding to go for broke. Which is just very uncharacteristic of the Supreme Leader's style. But he does make mistakes, so he could do something foolish, or you could have a new Supreme Leader who's more willing to take those risks.
I think that about does it for me. Armand, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think you wrapped over quite nicely. No.
Well, in that case, I want to thank Dr. Samore for coming on here. We're very fortunate to have him, and he gave us our full hour's worth and then some. To all of our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to like it and to follow us on social media. Our username is @BalancingPod on X. We're going to try and do our next episode within the next month or so. The likely next topic is going to be efforts to end the war in Ukraine, but obviously the content of that will change substantially based on what happens on the ground over there in the next few weeks. So keep an eye on our social media for updates. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you all soon.